Hi, I'm Toni Preckwinkle. This is Talk with Toni. And my guest is Jeff Deutsch, who is the Chief Executive Officer of Seminary Cooperative Bookstores in Hyde Park. Jeff, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
You know, I usually ask people to sort of begin with their own story. So how did you come to be a bookseller?
Yeah, so there are very few people who come to bookselling deliberately. Most people do it accidentally, including myself. And what I knew when I started my career is that I love being around books. I love serving folks. I love talking about books and sharing enthusiasm. So when I started in a bookstore as a part-time job when I was in my late teens, I had no idea that it was going to be a career. And I just, as the years went by, and it was so joyful and so nourishing and so meaningful, I thought, what else could I do? There's nothing else I could think of doing. And so I've actually spent my entire career in bookselling, with the exception of 2 years when I was a live-work artist in the mountains of California.
Oh my
and
God.
that is the only thing I've ever done other than bookstores in my career.
All right, now the Seminary Co-op Bookstore is one of, I don't know, half a dozen bookstores in the neighborhood. But it's unique in that it's a not-for-profit. How did that come to be?
That's right. So we are the first and only not-for-profit bookstore in the country, actually, whose mission is bookselling. And we made that transition 2 years ago. We were a member-owned cooperative. You were one of the members for 35 years. And we were owned by 60,000 people over those 58 years. And we thought, what is the point of being a cooperative when really what we're trying to do is not maximize the shareholder value, which is what a cooperative does, but to maximize the stakeholder value for our community. And the community was anyone who cared about books and bookstores. Because in the 21st century there was really no reason for a bookstore to exist in terms of buying books. You can buy books anywhere, and there is no reader who needs that bookstore in order to have that transaction. We asked the question, why do we need a bookstore? And we thought, well, browsing, a space for discovery, a space for community, a space to bring people together over the shared love of reading, that's the reason we have it, and we needn't have a profit incentive in order to do it.
Now, I love bookstores. Let me, full disclosure. As you said, I'm a longtime member of the Seminary Co-op. And I consider bookstores sort of community assets.
Right.
What does it mean to a community to have a bookstore?
Right, right. It's a great question, and it's one that we've actually tried to articulate the answer to just by recognizing that we are such a community space. And so you've spent so much time there. So many people have grown up in that store, third, fourth generation people in those stores. And we asked the question, why do they matter? Why do we want to keep a bookstore when really there's no financial incentive to do it and there's no need for it? And the answer for us was clear, that there's something about having books around. Just the presence of books is so important. A space to come maybe after school, the students from Ray across the street want to come by and do a little bit of homework and spend some time in the stacks. They find things on the shelves that they didn't know existed. They see things that they recognize themselves in them. They have an imagination they build while they're in the space. And we thought, that alone is enough to keep this space going, and let's find a way to support it and to build a community that actually begins in the store almost and works its way out.
We have several independent bookstores in the neighborhood. Seminary has two. 57th Street Books was always my grandchildren's favorite, since there are lots and lots of children's books there, and books for young adults as well as adults. And there's Powell's, which is a used bookstore down the street, also one of my favorite places. Why does our community have so many bookstores? Is it simply because the University of Chicago is there? What's going on?
That's a great question, and my hope is that more communities see the value in that space and that there are more bookstores that are created. We have great bookstores in Chicago in addition to just Hyde Park. So Women and Children First in Andersonville is a wonderful store. On a Bridge Books is a wonderful store. We've got Pilsen Community Books in Pilsen, and a store that's going to be opening this coming year, Burst Into Books, down on 110th in Michigan, which is going to be a wonderful, wonderful store. My sense is that actually I don't think that it's because of the University of Chicago exclusively. I actually think that my predecessors who created these stores, the booksellers who created these stores, and the community who owned it, actually both reflected what the university and the Hyde Park community, and including Bronzeville and South Shore, were doing, but they also created it. It actually, I don't know that Hyde Park and the South Side and the rich cultural history that exists there would have happened if it weren't for these stores. So I'm thinking about Powell's and 57th Street Books and Seminary Co-op, but also O'Gara and Wilson used to be there. There are many stores that were there. That actually really drew people as much as the university. There are plenty of great universities, including Yale, for instance, that have no bookstores. And to think about—
How can you have a university community and no bookstores?
Exactly. Well, I should say no great bookstores. But yes, exactly. Yale does not have a bookstore to speak of. And Princeton has one. It's a wonderful store, but they have one. And that seems telling. So no, I think it's actually the store itself generates this interest and it generates this community.
Now, the bookstore, in addition to selling books, has programming, okay? And you bring in authors. I've met authors there. What does that mean to the community, that they get to interact with authors and creative folks?
It's a great question. I see Zadie Smith's book back here.
Yeah, sure enough.
And I see Toni Morrison's book back here, and we hosted both of them, and Leon Forrest we hosted once upon a time. We were hosting about 700 author events a year, and we were doing that both in the stores but also within the community. And we would do it with places like Chicago Humanities Festival or American Writers Museum, but also block clubs in the South Shore Cultural Center and Gary Comer Youth Center. And the idea of bringing authors into community and bringing authors into the store and helping get the message out that books are an incredible way to interact with the world, to get to know the world we live in, but also our internal world and who we are as people, that is a mission for us. And this is one of the many ways that we do that. And we've thought not only is it important to do that in person, but also to do it in other ways. So we have a podcast, Open Stacks, that talks about not just the author talks, but has bookseller conversations. And what does it mean to spend 10 years writing a book and then see it out into the world and have it hopefully live on for decades? What does it mean to identify the books that endure, that aren't just of a moment, that magazine is on the shelf for a month and then it's gone? What does it mean?
The shelf life is
what does it mean?
Modest, yeah.
Right, and so and for us, we have books that are centuries old and books that are days old. And having them coexist is a really special way to bring the entire history of human experience together in one space.
Now, you talked about authors. I've seen a number of authors at your authors' readings and visits. And you brought a book by Leon Forrest. Why don't you tell us a little bit in particular about him? You mentioned him.
I did, yes. Thank you for asking. So this is a book called Divine Days, and it's a novel published in the early 90s. And for my money, it is not just the greatest Chicago novel. It is undoubtedly the great American novel and possibly one of the great novels ever written. And it's underappreciated, so I appreciate you asking about it.
Okay, I've heard of Leon Forrest, but that's all I can say.
Right, so he spent his entire, so he grew up on the south side of Chicago, went to Hyde Park High, African-American writer and thinker. He ended up as a professor at Northwestern. His first 3 books were edited by the great Toni Morrison when she was still an editor. And this is a very ambitious novel that tries to tell in 7 days, the history of the South Side of Chicago through the lens of one particular character listening to the voices that he hears. And it's based on James Joyce's Ulysses, of taking one day and trying to describe Dublin. And that also thinks about Shakespeare and Homer. That's one side of it. And then it thinks about oral history. And what is the oral history in the African-American experience with the Great Migration, goes back to New Orleans, thinks about what those voices are, what the music is in that mix of experience. And so the book takes place in Bronzeville, in South Shore, in Kenwood, in Hyde Park. And it is hilarious and beautiful and filled with life, and doesn't shy away from the difficult things and the tragedies and the injustices, and it considers all of that, but it does it through a lens of great literature, great storytelling, and great music.
All right. So this is on my my holiday reading list. Okay.
Read.
All right. Now, you've had lots of authors visit. In addition to Mr. Forrest, are there any other authors you'd like to call to our attention that come to mind for you in terms of their their readings or their presentations to the community?
I would love to. So one of my favorite poets working today is a poet named Nate Marshall. Grew up in the Wild Hundreds, and his first book of poetry is actually called The Wild Hundreds. It is also...
What is the Wild Hundreds?
So these are in Chicago, the streets.
The streets, okay. It's like K-Town, okay.
And the poems are gorgeous. They're so well wrought. He is such a delicate ear. And his second book is called Finna. It just came out last year, and it is a wonderful collection. So the poet Nate Marshall, I think, is worth checking out as well.
Wild Hundreds?
Wild Hundreds and Finna.
And Finna, Nate Marshall. Okay. Any other, we'll try for a trifecta. Anybody else you want to recommend?
Well, one other I'd recommend is Walt Whitman, who is one of the great poets and who writes about democracy in the broadest sense, what it means to embrace everyone, bring people together, bring more love into the world, and do it through a celebration of everyone. And so Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass is a book I'd recommend to all of humanity. There's no one who should shy away from that book. But I have to ask you what you would recommend and what you were reading.
Well, I'm waiting. I love fantasy. And so Genevieve Cogman has written a series of books, The Invisible Library. So my mother was a librarian, my sister's a librarian. So, you know, librarians are in the family. And this is a series of books about a time-traveling librarian. So that's what I'm reading at the moment.
That is the most perfect book for you. I love, of course, that's what you're reading at the moment. That's great. That is
so
great.
I'm awaiting the release of her 8th book in the series. That's quite true. But what I always recommend to people is to read Margaret Walker Alexander. I love her, speaking of poets, I love her poetry, and she wrote a novel called Jubilee, which I used to, when I was a history teacher, I would ask my kids to read to learn about the history of African Americans in the Civil War and Reconstruction. So I guess Margaret Walker Alexander is the person that I would recommend to folks. So.
Well, I would recommend you consider bookselling as your next career. You're excellent at it, and it's a calling for many of us.
Well, listen, so. As I said, there was a time when my grandchildren were little where I was spending $100 a month at the bookstore getting things for them. So listen, I've been a customer for a long time, and I'm grateful for the good work you do in the community. You know, our community wouldn't be the same without its bookstores. So I'm grateful to the folks who operate them and love them.
Yeah,
so
thank you.
Thank you, Jeff, for joining us. Again, thank you for joining us for Talk with Toni. My guest has been Jeff Deutsch from Seminary Cooperative Books.